Shabbat Shalom. This is part 3 of the Sabbath, Saturday versus Sunday discussion. To begin, I'd like to go to Daniel 7, um, verse 25, and it reads the following: And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws, and they shall be given into his hand and given into his hand until a time and times in the dividing of time, 3.5 years. In this prophecy, Daniel's prophesying about Antiochus Epiphanes, how he would and we know Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple, but how he would change God's appointed times, his feast. And so Antiochus Epiphanes was a precursor, a shadow of the future anti-Messiah, who's the worst and the greatest anti-Messiahs of all, which we know as the Antichrist, the beast. In the past, Satan has changed God's appointed times through these anti-Messiahs, one being Antiochus Epiphanes, through the Grecian Empire, and what we'll find out also through the Roman Empire. God calls these appointed times holy convocations. They were holy gatherings. The Hebrew word for convocation, the word that's used in Hebrew for convocation is mikra, which means rehearsal. So these feasts actually pointed to a future time. The Passover in Exodus 12 and spoken of Leviticus 3 pointed to the future Messiah. The Passover lamb was a shadow that pointed to the future Messiah, who was the light, the reality, the fulfillment of that law, the spiritual fulfillment of that law. And so on these times, these holy convocations, God meets with man. On one side you have the physical aspect of the law, on the other hand you have the spiritual aspect of the law. The right hand representing, God tells us not to go too far to the right or too far to the left, the right hand being the spiritual, the left hand being the physical. So there's a balance between physical and spiritual. There's a physical fulfillment of God's law, and there's a spiritual fulfillment of God's law. The Council of Nicaea changed the Sunday, changed the Sabbath to Sunday based upon the presumed idea that the Lord died then. If you place the crucifixion of Christ at 3 o'clock Friday, then you don't have a full 3 days. So we see Satan seeks to tamper God's set times so that God's not seen as true, his word's not seen as true. 3 o'clock Friday to 3 o'clock Saturday is one 24-hour day. 3 o'clock Saturday to 3 o'clock Sunday is only 2 days. So you see quickly, we have a problem. And if you use the Hebraic way of counting a day, it still wouldn't add up to the 3 days that Christ spoke of. The Synod, which is a miniature gathering, the Synod of Laodicea in 363 AD, canon number 29, forbids Gentiles from the Sabbath worship. The finding was ratified by the church bishops at the next full council meeting in 381 AD. That's taken from CircleGame.com. Canon number 29 says, and this is not an exact quote, but this is kind of paraphrased, it says, Christians shouldn't Judaize by rest on Sabbath. Honor the Lord's day, which was, of course, Sunday in their eyes. If any are found doing so, let them be anathema. This is taken from reluctantmessenger.com. Initially, Christianity was viewed as a sect of Judaism. After the Jewish revolts of 67 through 70 AD and 132 to 135 AD, Jewish practices in the church was viewed with hostility. And part of the reason we know Christianity was a sect of Judaism was because the law forbade anyone to worship, to do any other form of worship besides Judaism, and to worship the Caesar as God and the Greek gods. Those were the only two religions that were allowed. Everyone else, they were those other religions that tried to get started. They were thwarted. Um, there's no references of Sunday found until the writings of Barnabas and Justin around 135 AD and 150 AD. In fact, there's no scripture that we can look to, that we can find, in which God commands or changes the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday. Anytime you see someone saying that the Sabbath is now Sunday, that's their uh, that's their interpretation imposed upon the text, but there is no literal text that says the Sabbath is now Sunday. Sunday worship began to solidify um, uh, during the reign of Hadrian, 117 to 135. He greatly persecuted the Jews. In fact, he exiled the Jews from Jerusalem for 100 years. So the Gentile Christians in Jerusalem were, for the first time, cut off from their Hebraic understanding, Hebraic roots of Scripture, and their Hebraic customs that would be taught to them because the Jews were exiled. Hadrian prohibited Judaic practices, including the Sabbath, that discouraged Christians from observing the Sabbath. Uh, there was a great anti-Semitism during that time. Constantine said it seemed unworthy to keep the Jewish practices, and they impiously defiled their hands. Uh, Sunday is a day that was dedicated to worship for the sun god. There was the there was the Indo-Iranian god known as Mithra, and then there was the Greek god known as Apollo, which was the sun god, which was known to be the god of light, and we know that Christ is the light. It's interesting. Jews often refused to eat with pagans because their feasts were their eating and their feasts were done in honor and worship of their pagan gods. So Jews oftentimes wouldn't eat with some of the Gentiles, and the Gentiles, of course, took offense to that. And so that's part of how hostility towards Judaism and Hebrew practices and customs began. And now here we are, something that once seemed normal to the church is now strange to us, and we're relearning it now. Now that we've learned more about history. But the Jews, they've never let go of their customs. Some of this information is taken from www.ucg.org. In fact, there was such a great great hostility towards the Jews. When these laws were created, the Jews had to recite this creed in order to be a part of the Christian church. The creed recites as the following: I renounce all customs, rites, legalisms, unleavened breads, and sacrifices of lambs of the Hebrews, and all the other feasts of the Hebrews, sacrifices, prayers, aspersions, purifications, sanctifications, and propitiations, and fasts, and new moons, and Sabbaths, and superstitions, and hymns, and chants, and observances of synagogues, and the food and drink of the Hebrews. In one word, I renounce absolutely everything Jewish, every law, rite, and custom. And if afterwards I shall wish to deny and return to Jewish superstition, or shall be found eating with Jews, or feasting with them, or secretly conversing and condemning the Christian religion instead of openly confuting them and condemning their vain faith, then let the trembling of Cain and the leprosy of Gehazi cleave to me, as well as the legal punishments to which I acknowledge myself liable, and may I be anathema in the world to come, and may my soul be set down with Satan and the devils. So, when you have laws that one says that the Sabbath is on Sunday, and then two prohibits Sabbath worship, it's no wonder that uh, the church now would view, or at least the church then would view the Sabbath as being Sunday, the right and the only day. And now, through history, we've lost the knowledge of the true Sabbath and the true practices of the church, so that we think that the lie is actually the truth. The lie being that the Sabbath is Sunday, or that the Sabbath was changed to Sunday, when the Sabbath always was, always will be the seventh day, starting at sundown Friday, ending sundown Saturday. And that was taken from Restoring the Jewishness of the Gospel by Dr. David Stern, in Yeshua, the Real Jesus by Dr. Ron Mosley. I would like to read something interesting. In 2nd century historical work, Hegesippus describes the rivalry between a man named Theobotes and others seeking the position of bishop after the death of James, who was said to be the first pastor of Jerusalem. According to Hegesippus, the Hebrew Christians finally chose Simeon, a cousin of the Lord, to succeed James. Epiphanius lists the remaining 13 Jewish pastors of the Jerusalem church as Justus, Zacchaeus, Tobias, Benjamin, John, Matthias, Philip, Seneca, Justus, Levi, Ephraim, Joseph, and Jude, completing the historical record all the way up to the Bar Kokhba revolt. These Jewish relatives of Jesus, who led the early church, were called desposinoi, meaning heirs, and were often persecuted because of their Davidic lineage in their relationship to the Messiah. When Hadrian exiled the Jews from Jerusalem and set forth these laws prohibiting the Sabbath, the Christians, the Gentile Christians, lost their Hebraic understanding of the Scriptures and the Hebraic practices that were practiced by the disciples and early church leaders. With that being done, the first leader of the Church of Jerusalem, or the leader of the Church of Jerusalem after the Jews were exiled, became for the first time a Gentile leader, known as Mark, who obviously wouldn't be able to pass down the Hebraic customs, the Hebraic understanding of the Scriptures, and the Hebraic way of carrying out the Scriptures. Paul, the disciples, Christ, they all kept the Sabbath. Nowhere in the Gospels does Christ tell us not to keep the Sabbath, or that the Sabbath was changed to Sunday. That's part of the history and the departing of the true Sabbath. Some other time I'll probably talk about why the Lord wasn't resurrected on Sunday as commonly taught, and how that would actually be breaking the Scriptures in the day that he actually was resurrected, and how he truly did fulfill the Scriptures. Because through, God says that he wants us to worship him in spirit and in truth. And when you're trying to share the gospel and you're giving the incorrect version of the gospel, that can lead people away from Christ, because they think, or they know, that you're not teaching it the truth based upon facts. and you have to try to figure out what to do with it. You know, that's all I have to say, I guess. God bless. Beruchot and Shabbat Shalom.